The suitcase hit the driveway before I even understood what was happening. It split open on impact, and 10 years of my life scattered across the concrete. A wedding photo, a folded cardigan, the paperback I'd been reading for 3 weeks and never finished. My husband stood in the doorway of the house I had lived in for 6 years, the house I had painted and planted and paid taxes on, and he looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has wandered onto your property. "This house is mine, Elena," he said. "It's always been mine. Get your things and go." I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do with the sentence. Behind him, through the open door, I could see the living room I had furnished piece by piece, the fireplace I had chosen the tile for, the staircase where we had taken our anniversary photos every October for a decade. He had never once, in 6 years, asked whose name was on the deed. I was about to find out that neither had I, and that the answer was about to end his entire world, not mine. But to understand how a man could stand in a doorway and confidently lie to the woman he married, you have to go back. Not to that morning. Not even to that year. You have to go back to a name I hadn't spoken aloud in almost 2 years, a name that was about to walk through that same door, holding a manila folder that would make my husband's face go the color of old paper. Her name was Adele Bell, and she was a lawyer. But she wasn't there for him. She was there for me. 10 years earlier, I was 24 years old and renting a single room above a dry cleaner in a part of the city that smelled permanently of steam and detergent. I had a design degree, a stack of unpaid invoices from a boutique that had gone under, and a grandmother named Margaret who called every Sunday at exactly 6 o'clock, without fail, for my entire life. Daniel Cole walked into that same boutique 3 weeks before it closed, looking for curtains for an office he hadn't leased yet. He was 31, sharp-jawed, the kind of confident that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He talked about buildings the way other men talked about women, with hunger, with plans, with a gleam that made you want to be part of whatever he was building. I fell for him the way you fall downstairs. Fast, and without meaning to, and by the time I understood what was happening, I was already at the bottom. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony my grandmother paid for without ever explaining where the money came from. I didn't ask. That was the first mistake, not the last one, but the first. My grandmother had raised me alone after my mother died young, and she had a way of appearing with exactly the right amount of money at exactly the right moment, and disappearing back into her modest little house in the hills before anyone could ask her how. "Some things you don't question," she used to tell me, stirring sugar into tea with a spoon that didn't match the set. "You just say thank you, and you keep the receipts." I thought she meant it as a joke. Daniel's career accelerated the way a fire does, slow at first, and then all at once. He left the real estate agency where we'd met and started his own development firm, Cole & Associates, flipping small residential lots into modern builds for young professionals who wanted exposed brick and bad Wi-Fi. I did the interiors on his early projects for free, because that's what wives do when their husbands are building something, and because every time I raised a question about money, he'd smile and say, "Just trust me. I've got this." 6 years ago, he came home glowing, holding a folder of paperwork. "We got the house," he said. "The one on Ash Grove. I closed on it this morning." I remember crying at the kitchen table that night, genuinely, foolishly happy. It was a beautiful house, white shutters, a wraparound porch, a garden with enough sun for tomatoes. Daniel told me he'd secured a private loan through an investment contact, something to do with favorable terms and a silent partner who preferred to stay out of the paperwork. I never saw a closing document. I never saw a mortgage statement. I saw a husband who came home each night talking about square footage and equity, and I believed every word, because that is what a wife does when a marriage is still new enough to trust blindly. I didn't know, that night, that the down payment on that house had come from an account I had never heard of, an account with my name quietly attached to it as a beneficiary, funded by a woman who had been watching my marriage far more carefully than I ever gave her credit for. My grandmother died 2 years ago, in the spring, in her sleep, in the same modest house she'd lived in since before I was born. At the funeral, her lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Harold Voss, who I later learned shared her maiden name, though I never once asked why, handed me a small cedar box with a brass key shaped like a fox soldered onto its lid. "She said you'd know when to open it," he told me. "She said not before." I put the box on the top shelf of our closet, behind winter coats, and I forgot about it the way you forget about grief when you're too busy trying to survive your own marriage. I should have opened it 18 months ago. That was when the first sign appeared, small, easy to explain away, the kind of thing you notice and then talk yourself out of noticing. Daniel started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. He started closing his laptop a half-second too fast when I walked into the room. He started working site visits on weekends for a project he called Riverside, a marina redevelopment he described in vague, glowing terms whenever I asked, the way people describe things they don't actually want you to understand. And then, 4 months ago, I found the receipt. It was tucked into the pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner. The same dry cleaner, coincidentally, above which I had once rented a room and dreamed about a different life. A dinner receipt for 2, at a restaurant across town, at 9:40 on a Tuesday night when Daniel had told me he was stuck at the site. The name on the reservation wasn't mine. It was Vanessa Marsh. I didn't confront him that night. I sat with the receipt for 3 days, turning it over like it might change its answer if I asked it enough times. When I finally did search her name, what I found didn't just confirm an affair. It opened a door onto something far bigger and far stranger than I had prepared myself for. Vanessa Marsh was a junior architect at a firm called Redline Design, the same firm handling the drawings for Daniel's Riverside Marina project. Her online presence was carefully curated, all soft lighting and architectural sketches, but buried 3 pages deep in a public record search was something that made my stomach drop in a completely different direction. Her apartment lease, filed 8 months earlier, listed the property manager as a company called Voss Holdings LLC. I stared at that name for a long time. Voss. My grandmother's maiden name. The same name on the lawyer who'd handed me the cedar box. I told myself it was a coincidence, a common enough name, a common enough word, nothing more. I closed the laptop and went to bed and lay awake until 4 in the morning, and somewhere in that darkness, a much older memory surfaced. I was 9 years old, sitting on my grandmother's porch, and a man in a grey suit had come to the door asking to speak to Ms. Voss about a signature on a building permit. My grandmother had stepped outside, closed the door behind her, and spoken to him in a tone I had never heard her use before. Clipped, precise, entirely unlike the woman who hummed while she gardened. When she came back inside, I asked her who the man was. "Nobody important," she said. "Just business." I hadn't thought about that porch in 25 years. I thought about it now, at 4 in the morning, lying next to a husband who had started sleeping with his back to me, and I began to understand that my grandmother's life had contained rooms I was never invited into. The confrontation with Daniel happened 2 weeks later, and it did not go the way I had imagined it in my head 100 times. I laid the receipt on the kitchen counter, the same counter where he'd once spread out the closing paperwork for a house I now understood I knew almost nothing about, and I asked him, calmly, who Vanessa Marsh was. He didn't deny it. That was the part that broke something in me faster than the affair itself. He simply straightened his shoulders, the way he did before difficult client meetings, and said, "I think we both know this marriage has been over for a while, Elena. I've been carrying this house, this family, this whole life, for years. I think it's time we're honest about that." "Carrying it," I repeated. "With whose money, Daniel?" Something flickered across his face, fast, almost imperceptible, but I had spent 10 years learning that face, and I knew a flinch when I saw one. "With my money," he said. "Every cent." I wanted to believe he was simply cruel. It would have been easier. But a small, cold part of me, the part that had inherited more from my grandmother than I realized, understood in that moment that he wasn't just angry. He was afraid. And men like Daniel didn't get afraid over affairs. They got afraid over money. 3 days later, he filed for divorce. And 4 days after that, on a Thursday morning while I was still in my robe drinking coffee at the kitchen table, 2 moving men he'd hired without telling me showed up at the front door with a truck, and Daniel followed behind them holding a folder of documents he waved at me like a flag of victory. "The house is in my name," he said. "I checked with my lawyer. You have 30 minutes to get what you need." That was the morning the suitcase hit the driveway. That was the morning 10 years of my life split open on the concrete, and a man I had loved since I was 24 years old looked at me like an obstacle he'd finally cleared. What he didn't know What I barely knew myself, standing there in the driveway with a torn cardigan in my hands, was that the folder in his grip meant nothing. Because the real folder, the one that actually mattered, was sitting in a cedar box on the top shelf of a closet he had just thrown me out of. And I was about to go get it. I stayed with my friend Priya that first week, sleeping on a pull-out couch that smelled like her cat, staring at the ceiling and replaying 10 years of my life like a film reel I couldn't stop. Daniel changed the locks on the third day. I found out because I drove past the house on my way to work and saw a locksmith's van in the driveway, parked exactly where my suitcase had landed. I called Harold Voss that night. I don't fully know why, some instinct, some thread pulling tight in the back of my mind that connected a porch conversation from 25 years ago to an apartment lease held by a company with my grandmother's maiden name. I think it's time, I told him. For the box. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I was wondering when you'd call, he said finally. Come to my office tomorrow. Bring the box. Don't open it until I'm there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on Priya's pull-out couch with the cedar box in my lap, running my thumb over the brass fox soldered to its lid, feeling the small weight of it and wondering what kind of woman leaves her granddaughter a locked box instead of a conversation. I thought about the calls every Sunday at 6 o'clock. I thought about the wedding she'd paid for without explanation. I thought about the man in the grey suit on the porch, and the words "just business," and I understood, with a strange and sudden clarity, that my grandmother had spent my entire childhood protecting me from something by keeping me completely unaware of it. Harold's office was small and lined with law books that looked older than both of us combined. He set the cedar box on the desk between us, produced a second key from his own drawer, identical to mine, another small brass fox, and told me that the box required both keys turned simultaneously to open. My grandmother, it seemed, had built even her final gift with a kind of architecture. Nothing could be opened alone. Inside was a letter in her handwriting, a stack of documents bound in a leather folder, and a single photograph of a much younger version of my grandmother standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, her arms crossed, her expression fierce in a way I had genuinely never seen on her face in my entire life. The letter began, "My darling Elena, if you are reading this, then you have finally needed the thing I built. I am sorry I never told you sooner. I was afraid that if you knew too early, you would live your whole life waiting for permission instead of living it freely. Now you need the truth, so here it is." She wrote that after her own marriage ended, badly, decades ago, to a man who had tried to take everything from her the same way, she said, "Men like that always try." She had built a company under her maiden name specifically so that no husband, no court, no man in a grey suit could ever again touch what she had earned. She called it Voss Holdings. Over 40 years, quietly, invisibly, it had acquired property across the city, apartment buildings, small commercial lots, and eventually, development loans issued to promising young builders who needed capital and didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. One of those builders, she wrote, was a young man named Daniel Cole. I had to read that line 4 times before it settled into my body. She had watched him from the very beginning. She had funded the down payment on our house, the house Daniel believed he'd secured through an investment contact, through Voss Holdings, listing the deed under a subsidiary company with a name deliberately unrelated to hers or mine, so that neither Daniel nor I would ever think to question it. She had done it, she wrote, not to control me, but to protect me, in case the day ever came when I needed a floor to stand on that no one could pull out from under me. And then came the second revelation, the one that made Harold Voss watch my face very carefully as I read it. Voss Holdings hadn't just funded our house. 3 years ago, it had become the primary lender behind Cole and Associates' largest project, the Riverside Marina development, the one Daniel talked about in vague, glowing terms every time I asked. My grandmother, from her modest little house in the hills, had quietly become the financial backbone of my husband's entire company, without either of us ever knowing. "There's a clause," Harold said gently, sliding a second document across the desk. "In the loan agreement. A change of control provision. If the borrower's marital status changes in a way that materially affects the collateral structure. In this case, if a divorce is filed involving property connected to the loan, the full balance becomes due immediately." I stared at the number at the bottom of the page. $4.2 million. Due in 30 days. He doesn't know, I said, more to myself than to Harold. No, Harold agreed. He has no idea whose money built his career. And in 11 days, when his lawyer files the divorce paperwork and triggers that clause, he's going to find out in the worst possible way. I thought about the suitcase on the driveway. I thought about the locksmith's van. I thought about Daniel standing in the doorway of a house he had never once, in 6 years, actually owned, telling me to get out of it. For the first time since that morning, I stopped feeling like a woman who had lost everything. I started feeling like a woman who was about to find out exactly what she still had. The next 11 days moved with a strange, quiet tension, like the air before a storm that everyone can feel but no one can name. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't fight the divorce filing. I let his lawyer send letters to an address he assumed I'd abandoned, and I let him believe, for as long as possible, that he had one. Harold explained the mechanics carefully, the way you'd explain a bomb to someone who needed to walk past it without flinching. As trustee of Voss Holdings following my grandmother's death, I now controlled the very company that held the deed to our house and the loan behind Daniel's biggest project. Nothing illegal had occurred. Nothing needed to be manufactured. The truth, simply stated in the correct legal language at the correct moment, would do all the work by itself. On the 7th day, Harold called me with something that made the quiet tension of that week snap taut. Daniel, it turned out, had spent the previous 48 hours trying to quietly refinance the Riverside Marina loan through a second lender, attempting to pay off the Voss Holdings balance before the change of control clause could ever be triggered in a way anyone would notice. He didn't yet know who held the loan. He only knew, somehow, that something about his financing had become unstable, and instinct, the same instinct that had built his career out of nothing, told him to move fast and quietly before whatever it was caught up to him. He came close, Harold admitted. Closer than I expected. A private equity group in the city was 2 signatures away from buying out the note. If they had closed before your divorce filing officially processed, the clause would never have activated at all. He would have kept the house, kept the project, and neither of you would have ever known your grandmother had anything to do with any of it. I remember sitting very still when he told me that, understanding for the first time just how thin the thread had actually been, that if Daniel had moved one day faster, if his new lender's paperwork had cleared one afternoon sooner, I would have spent the rest of my life believing the version of events he'd handed me on that driveway. The house would have simply been his. The truth would have stayed locked in a cedar box on a shelf I might never have thought to open again. What stopped it? I asked. You did, Harold said. The moment his lawyer filed the divorce, the clause activated automatically, the same hour, before the refinance could close. He was racing a version of the truth he didn't even know existed. He lost by 4 hours. 4 hours. I have thought about that number more times than I can count since. How close an entire life can come to unraveling in a completely different direction, how thin the margin actually is between the story someone tells you and the one that's true. There was one more discovery in those 11 days, and it was the one that finally, fully closed the door on any lingering doubt I had about the man I'd married. Harold pulled the tenant records for the apartment complex managed under Voss Holdings, the same complex where Vanessa Marsh lived. Her lease had been co-signed 8 months earlier by a guarantor, because her income as a junior architect hadn't qualified her alone. The guarantor's name, listed in small print on page 3 of a document neither of them ever imagined a stranger would read, was Daniel Cole. He had been paying for his mistress's apartment using funds routed through his company's operating account, the same account fed, 3 layers removed, by loans from my grandmother's company. He had used my family's money to fund the affair that ended our marriage, in an apartment owned, invisibly, by my family's company, without either of us knowing the walls around him had my grandmother's fingerprints on every brick. Some stories are ironic by accident. This one felt engineered by something larger than coincidence, and for the first time since the funeral, I found myself talking to my grandmother out loud in an empty room, thanking her, the way she'd always told me to. Daniel scheduled what his lawyer called a final settlement walkthrough for the following Friday, a meeting at the house, ostensibly to finalize which of my remaining belongings I could collect, though I suspected the real purpose was smaller and crueler than that. I think he wanted me to watch him stand in that house one more time, secure in his ownership, so I would understand, completely, how thoroughly I had lost. Harold offered to send a colleague. I told him I needed to be there myself. I arrived at 11 that morning. Daniel's lawyer, a tall man named Reeves with an expensive watch and an unhurried walk, was already in the living room with a stack of papers organized in color-coded folders. Daniel stood near the fireplace I had chosen the tile for, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. And standing slightly apart from both of them, unannounced, dressed in a charcoal blazer with a single manila folder tucked under one arm, was a woman I had never met. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending a hand he didn't take, because he was too busy staring at her like she'd walked into the wrong meeting. "My name is Adele Bell. I represent Voss Holdings LLC. I believe we have some paperwork to discuss regarding this property, and regarding a loan associated with your company." I watched the color drain out of Daniel's face in real time, like watching a tide go out. "I'm sorry," Reeves said, glancing between Adele and the folder in his hands. "Voss Holdings. I'm not familiar with. This house is deeded to Cole and Associates, purchased 6 years ago through a private loan," Adele finished for him, opening her folder and sliding a single document across the coffee table, "originated by Voss Holdings LLC, secured against this property, and structured with a change of control clause triggered by material changes to the borrower's marital and financial circumstances. A clause activated 11 days ago, when your client filed for divorce naming shared marital assets." Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. That's not possible. My contact for that loan was Harold Voss," Adele said. "Acting on behalf of Margaret Voss, and following her passing, on behalf of the trust's current controlling trustee." She turned, then, and looked directly at me for the first time, though I understood from the set of her shoulders that she had known exactly who I was the entire time. "Mrs. Cole," she said, "would you like to confirm your role for the record?" I felt every eye in that room land on me at once. Daniel's face had gone through 3 or 4 expressions in the last 30 seconds, confusion, disbelief, something close to panic, and was now settling into a kind of dawning, horrified understanding. "I'm the trustee of Voss Holdings LLC, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "My grandmother founded the company. This house was purchased through it. Your loan for the Riverside Marina project was funded through it as well." "That's impossible," Daniel said, and there was something almost pleading in the way he said it now, all the confidence I'd married drained clean out of his voice. "You don't know anything about finance, about business, you've never, this can't be your money, Elena, you don't even." "I didn't know either," I said. "Until 11 days ago. Which is, coincidentally, exactly how long that clause has been active." Adele slid the second document across the table, the loan agreement for Riverside Marina, the $4.2 million balance highlighted in yellow, the 30-day repayment window beginning to count down from the date already printed at the top of the page. Reeves picked it up, scanned it twice, and I watched a man who charged $400 an hour go visibly pale. "Daniel," Reeves said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." But Daniel wasn't looking at his lawyer anymore. He was looking at me, and for one long moment, standing in the living room of a house he had thrown me out of 11 days earlier, I watched him finally understand what he had actually lost. Not the house, not even the money, but the fact that the woman he'd dismissed as someone who didn't know anything about finance had, without ever meaning to, held the deed to his entire life the whole time. "There's one more matter," Adele said, and something in her tone told me she'd saved this for last on purpose. She pulled a third document from her folder, a rental ledger, a name highlighted in the same pale yellow. "Voss Holdings also holds the lease on a residential unit currently occupied by a Miss Vanessa Marsh. The guarantor on that lease, Mr. Cole, is you. Company funds were used for the guarantee. I mention this only because it will be relevant to the asset disclosure required in the divorce proceedings." I watched Daniel sit down. Not choose to sit. His legs simply stopped holding him up, and he found the arm of the sofa I had picked out 5 years earlier, and he sat on it like a man whose whole architecture had quietly collapsed from the foundation up. The house was quiet the way a room is quiet after a storm has finally passed through it. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied out, wrung dry. Reeves left first, murmuring something about needing to review the documents before advising his client further. Daniel didn't say a word to me for a long time. He sat on the arm of that sofa staring at the loan agreement like it might rearrange itself into a different answer if he looked at it long enough. "You knew," he finally said, though it wasn't really a question. "This whole time, you knew, and you let me." "I knew for 11 days, Daniel," I said. "You knew about Vanessa for 8 months. I think we should be careful about who's allowed to feel betrayed in this room." He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected him to. Adele gave us a moment, stepping toward the window, giving us the kind of privacy a stranger offers when she already knows exactly how the conversation is going to end. I looked around the living room, the fireplace tile, the staircase where we'd taken 10 anniversary photos, the garden I could see through the window where I'd once grown tomatoes I never got to harvest because Daniel said the vines looked unprofessional from the street. I had spent 6 years building a home inside a house I never actually needed to fight for. My grandmother had made sure of that before I ever understood I might need it. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, and for the first time in years, he sounded genuinely young, genuinely lost, the way he must have sounded before ambition hardened into the shape of a man who threw suitcases onto driveways. "Now," I said, "you have 30 days to find $4.2 million, or Voss Holdings takes controlling interest in Riverside Marina as collateral. That part isn't up to me anymore. That's the loan agreement my grandmother wrote a long time before either of us knew each other." "And the house?" I looked at him for a long moment. Some part of me, a small, tired, wounded part, wanted to watch him lose the house the exact way he tried to take it from me, publicly, humiliatingly, with moving trucks and a 30-minute deadline. But I understood, standing there, that becoming him wasn't a victory. It was just a different kind of loss, wearing a nicer outfit. "The house stays in Voss Holdings," I said. "It always was. You can stay until the divorce is finalized, in the guest room, if you'd like. Or you can go stay with Vanessa. I genuinely don't care which. But I'll be moving my things back in on Monday, because unlike you, I actually know whose name is on the deed." His phone buzzed on the coffee table while he was still sitting there, staring at nothing. I saw the name on the screen before he silenced it. Vanessa. He didn't answer. I understood, watching him not answer, that some part of him already knew what that call would be about, and that he wasn't ready yet to hear it out loud from someone who'd expected him to still have something to offer her. It rang again 2 minutes later. This time he picked it up and walked toward the kitchen, lowering his voice, but the house was quiet enough that fragments still reached me. "I don't know yet." "No, listen to me. It's not what you think." I recognized the tone. It was the same tone he'd once used with me, in this same kitchen, over a receipt with someone else's name on it. It is a strange kind of justice, hearing the exact voice that once lied to you now failing to reassure somebody else. He didn't say anything else to me when he came back. There wasn't much left to say. Adele walked me out to my car, and as we crossed the driveway, the same concrete where my suitcase had split open 11 days earlier, she paused and looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Your grandmother built something remarkable," she said. "Most people spend their whole lives building an empire to show it off. She spent hers building one so quiet, no one even knew to be afraid of it until it was too late to fight." "I don't think she built it to be an empire," I said. "I think she built it so I'd never have to stand in a driveway wondering if I had anywhere left to go." The Riverside Marina project collapsed within the month. Daniel couldn't raise $4.2 million in 30 days. No one can, not honestly, not without selling off pieces of a company that was already stretched thin trying to look bigger than it was. Voss Holdings took controlling interest in the development as the loan agreement specified, and I made the decision, as trustee, to bring in a new development partner and finish the project under a different name. It opens next spring. I've started walking the site on weekends, the way Daniel once did, though I go for entirely different reasons, not to admire what I'm building, but simply because it's mine, and I like standing in places that are mine. Cole and Associates folded 4 months after that Friday afternoon in the living room. Daniel moved in with Vanessa, briefly, until the lease Voss Holdings held on her apartment expired and wasn't renewed. Not out of spite, Harold assured me, simply standard portfolio management for a unit whose guarantor no longer had the income to justify the risk. I heard, secondhand, through Priya, who heard it through someone else, that he's working for another firm now, further down the ladder than he started, learning what it feels like to build something without a silent foundation holding him up. I don't feel triumphant when I think about him. I thought I would. I spent the first few weeks after that Friday waiting for the satisfaction to arrive, the way you wait for a song's chorus to finally hit, and instead what I felt, underneath everything, was something closer to grief, not for the marriage, which I understood now had been built on sand long before I ever found that receipt, but for the version of myself who had spent 10 years asking for so little, thanking a man for scraps of a life I had actually been capable of building myself the entire time. I moved back into the house on Ash Grove 3 weeks after that meeting. I repainted the guest room, the one Daniel had briefly slept in before he left for good, and I planted tomatoes again in the garden he once said looked unprofessional. They came in late that year, small and a little misshapen, and I have never, in my entire life, tasted anything as good as those first ones, warm off the vine, eaten standing barefoot in grass that belonged, undeniably and completely, to me. I opened the cedar box again, a few months later, not because I needed anything from it, but because I wanted to read my grandmother's letter one more time, slower this time, without the weight of an emergency pressing down on every line. Near the bottom, in a postscript I'd rushed past the first time, she'd written something I think about now almost every day. I never told you about Voss Holdings because I didn't want you to build your confidence on a safety net you knew was underneath you. I wanted you to learn to stand on your own first. The money was only ever meant to catch you if you fell, not to hold you up while you were still capable of walking. I understood, reading it again, that she hadn't just left me a company. She had left me a lesson disguised as an inheritance, that the strongest kind of security is the kind you don't know you have until the exact moment you need it, because that's the only way you ever find out whether you were strong enough to survive without it in the first place. I asked Harold, once, over coffee in his cramped little office, who the man in the grey suit on my grandmother's porch had actually been all those years ago. He smiled, in the way people smile when they've been waiting a long time for a question they were finally allowed to answer. Your grandfather's business partner, he said. Before your grandmother bought him out of everything he thought he still controlled. That was, I believe, the first house she ever took back. He paused, stirring his coffee slowly. I was 11 years old, sitting on the porch steps that day, listening to the whole thing. She was my aunt, Elena. Not by blood, by choice, the way she chose most of her family. She trained me herself, later, specifically so that someone would still be standing in that office long after she was gone, ready for the day her granddaughter finally needed him. I sat with that for a long time after he said it, the idea that my grandmother hadn't simply built a company. She had built an entire quiet architecture of protection, decades deep, with people and structures and contingencies stretching so far back into her life that I had only ever seen the smallest visible corner of it, the way you see the tip of something enormous floating mostly beneath the surface of still water. I turned the 2 brass fox keys back into their locks that evening, closing the box the way my grandmother must have closed it decades earlier, and I placed it on the mantel of the fireplace I had chosen the tile for, in the living room of the house that had always, quietly, impossibly, been mine. Some doors take a lifetime to open. But when they finally do, they don't just change what you own. They change what you know you were capable of the whole time.